Hey everyone, this is your first asynchronous lecture. I'm going to try to keep it brief, but I want to explore this topic I've been talking to you about the um, sort of relative abstraction or concreteness of language. The way in which language can refer to more or less abstract or concrete meanings, more or less embodied meanings. There are two basic ways in which language works. Concepts, the literal meanings of words, transcend the changeable material world, right? So these concepts are like categories that we use to organize the changeable, unpredictable, weird details of experience. So, this is a mug. Um, but it's also this particular weird thing, like, it's a totally unique thing, and yet I can use the concept, and that is a necessary function of language. That's what makes language work. Adaptability to all the particular weird, absolutely idiosyncratic things. So that difference between the abstract concept and the particular thing. We organize the particular things under the broad abstract categories. But there's another way in which language works, besides this Platonic way, relying on the abstract categories. Another way in which language works is by metaphor, not literal language, but figural language, figurative or figural language. Arguably, all language began as metaphors referencing actual sensual embodied experience in the world, like mug. Mug, jug, lug. They sort of evoke figurally, associatively, they echo a sensuous experience of carrying somehow. They're not just abstract concepts. They echo a sensuous embodied experience somehow. So arguably all language derived from metaphor. All language arguably derived from song and dance. That's our and is not so different from birdsong. It's just we have refined our systems of communication into these abstract concepts and imagine them to transcend time and embodied experience in the world. Hence this continuum. So we have the dictionary definitions of words, the supposedly literal meanings, and we imagine that these don't change, that these are like fixed in the sky platonically. But most communication is actually figural communication. They even say most communication is nonverbal. It's wild to think, but that estimates between 55% and 95% of communication that people actually do does not have to do with its supposed literal meaning, which is crazy to think, because we think we're always talking, what do I mean? I'm thinking, I have ideas, I'm trying to transmit this information to you. But think about your communication in actual life. How much of it is actually transmitting information? How much information transfer is actually going on? It's probably, a lot of the time, not that much. Communication is often much more about this unspoken transmission of mood, of mutual recognition, um, a kind of attunement, something more like music, of bodies, emotions. I mean, look at me talking, like this kind of thing. So that's what I mean when I say figural. I mean actual figures, materiality. That's a big part of what's getting communicated in language. That's why I call metaphor the body language of language. Um, and, and so I really want to emphasize that language is embodied as much as we, especially in English department at the university, think about the abstract meanings of words. Um, for someone like me, I'm way more interested in the musical side of language, like the poetics, the poetry. I think that's what makes literature literature. What makes studying literature so interesting is that it's about translating, the weird, ineffable, you know, uh, condition of embodiment into language indirectly. And these stories that we're reading are so powerful in terms of the way in which they bring in otherwise um, unspoken, unacknowledged bodily experience. And I really want you to try to open yourself up to feel how weird and troubling in these stories are. Hopeful Monsters makes a reference to Alien, the movie Alien, and that's appropriate. That it's an iconic horror. So these are the three levels: the literal meaning, figural meaning, and then the proper name is arguably the most concrete, in the sense that you are your name. Your name names something that's alive, that's always changing, that's active. I mean, does your name apply to your corpse? Is that still you? Um, so, in a way, your name is the most concrete dimension of language, insofar as it has no meaning, or the meaning of your name is always unfolding in time with you living. But on the other hand, a name is a name, as opposed to you. So there is a kind of abstraction in that. Um, but so I'm trying to make you think about this continuum of language, that we're always kind of moving back and forth between the more abstract, unchanging definitions of words to the here and now, absolutely particular, that you can only um, understand by pointing at it. You are you. Um, Maybe even something to which you're not reducible to your name, um, that is alive in language, though. A condition of language is making that reference to the here and now. I mean, just that word, um, here and now, or this, that, now, um, are ways in which language allows us to, or um, allows us and compels us to think about the uniqueness of an embodied experience in the moment. Okay, let's look at the first little italicized paragraph in Hopeful Monsters. See if we can uh, parse out these three levels. Goldsmith did not object to general microevolutionary principles. However, he veered from the synthetic theory in his belief that a new species develops suddenly through discontinuous variation or macromutation. He agreed that most macromutations ended disastrously with what he called monsters. Nonetheless, Goldschmidt believed that a small percentage of macromutations could, with chance and luck, equip an organism with radically beneficial adaptive traits with which to survive and prosper. These he called hopeful monsters. Okay. Um, so, first thing to say, this is a matter of interpretation. We're doing literary interpretation. There's no right and wrong objective. I mean, the point about these different levels here, is the interplay of objectivity and subjectivity, right? I mean, this is timeless dictionary. There's right and wrong definitions in an objective sense. But when we get down to the subjective level, which I've suggested is the huge, overwhelming bulk of communication, these are meanings that are changing every second. They're about context, the being situated in a particular place and time, having particular perspectives, and applying maybe the literal meanings in ever changing new contexts. So that means us now. We're bringing our own context here and now. And that's what's cool about literature, is what this text means now is its own thing. It's inviting us to react to it now. Um, and just like music, music is what music does. It's not something that lives on the page of the musical score. It's something that happens when you listen to it, and that experience is always a new thing. It takes place in time, just in literature the same way. So again, there's no right and wrong answers. Living um, is always changing moment to moment, and that is true also of reading. Um, the experience of reading is a chance to learn about where we are. So let's look at this and see in terms of these different levels I've talked about. I mean, certain things jump out, are not too hard to interpret or not too subject to interpretation. Macromutation, microevolution, synthetic theory. These are heavy duty dictionary words. Technical, um, objective definitions for all of them. On the other hand, the other end of the spectrum, Goldschmidt is a um, clear clear name. Um, but like Frankenstein, it's the name of the scientist. So in a way, it's like he Goldschmidt. He is aligned with these. He's taking a clinical, objective view. He's just the name for the kind of godlike perspective that applies these literal words. Where does actual subjectivity, come into this passage? I mean, Goldschmidt, as a scientist, doesn't want to be expressing subjectivity. He's expressing his theory of macro mutation and micro mutation. These are not subjective expressions, what he says about these technical terms. But some subjectivity does come in, right? I mean, these terms, monster, hopeful, disaster, what it means to prosper, dictionary definitions only get you so far with words like this. They're expressive of particular subjective views, expressive of particular contexts, and so on, that change across time and place. So I think you can, go in even into this little passage here and find more subtle, interesting kinds of questions. It's like, what's the difference between continuous and discontinuous, synthetic, sudden discontinuous variation versus continuous evolution? Expresses a subjective point of view. What do you notice as discontinuous? When does something jump into the foreground rather than just being part of the background? What's a sudden discontinuous veering from the continuous background of change. That's a subjective selection. It's a subjective noticing. I choose to notice that, and that's what this story is about, right? Noticing. What gets noticed is different, and of course, monsters. Let's see, put in quotation marks. Scare quote. It's an interesting body language, figurative language there. He's saying monsters, I don't really mean monsters, but I kind of do. So I'm using it, but in quotation marks as a kind of alibi to say I'm saying it, but not saying it. That's a gesture. It's like, what I'm talking about. Um, even though I can't say it, saying it anyway. That again, body language is finessing this awkward um, lack of place in language. And these other terms are likewise ambiguously subjective. Um, Chance, luck, beneficial adaptation, uh, to prosper and survive. I mean, survive is objective, but all these other terms are evaluative. So it's sort of indicating, again, precisely what the story is about, that survival depends on affirmation, subjective affirmation, is choosing to notice it, but also to evaluate it positively as beneficial, adaptive, in service of prosperity. Um, it's a chance and luck. What gets called good luck versus bad luck? These are, subjective evaluations that are getting disguised as if they were technical terms like macromutation, microevolution, and synthesis, and so on. I'll talk about this more when I talk about Frankenstein, but Goldschmidt, it's like a name, but it's also, the a symbol of the scientist's pretense to objectivity. And it also hints at money, like Frankenstein. Frankenstein means currency, like a franc, like a stamp. Gold, likewise. A quantifiable measure of value, abstract measure of value. Like currency, everything has its price. So currency is a way of mediating between the concrete particular and some kind of supposedly totally abstract measure of value. So we can see Goldschmidt performing this translation here. And that's what the story does, explores the possibility of this translation, the horrific body, into some term of cultural recognition as social belonging. Like the lesbian couple has the book of names. Do you belong in the book? That's a question. That do you belong in the story? Not just this story, but like the human story. So the same continuum is helpful for thinking about the different narrators of these different stories. So we've got 4 stories. So 3 basic different kinds of categories of narrative perspective. The omniscient narrator, the God's eye view, that's very common in novels. Just the narrator that explains all the story, tells the story from third person point of view, detached, all seeing. He did this, she thought that, and so on. The God's eye view has also been called the view from nowhere. It's weirdly disembodied. It's nobody's particular perspective, the omniscient narrator. But it's pretended because of it's not located in any particular subjective perspective. The omniscient point of view it pretends to give us a literal reality, objective reality. Um, so other stories or novels uh, are told from the perspective of a particular character, the view from somewhere in the world that's the setting of the story, subjectively situated in and expressive of specific embodied social historical contexts. Um, so this is narration from a perspective like the one in which we live. Doesn't see everything, but that's what makes it real for in real life. We never inhabited in real life an omniscient perspective. The omniscient perspective is a conceit we use for science, for history, you know, as if we could see the objective picture, the God's eye view from nowhere. We tell history from this perspective, or scientific analysis, um, as if we could be objective. But this is a kind of consensus fiction or conceit that enables communication. We can agree on this sort of objective fiction, but we could never actually witness it ourselves from our own perspective, which is always somewhere, again, situated and expressive of being in a particular context. Then the third uh, level here would be a narrator who is nothing more than the internal perspective of a personal ego. So this is arguably just as abstract as the God's eye view. The radically internal ego perspective maybe is as equally placeless as the God's eye view. Um, but the act of narrating is concrete action, putting the narrative down on the page or saying the narration is the act of a character, a particular characterization of the I. So in that sense, it's the most concrete. It's like the text is the artifact, the expression of a particular character. Frankenstein is composed of these letters that particular characters write. So the book it almost brings us into the story ourselves. That the book is an artifact created by characters in the story. Same thing with Unless the Eye Catch Fire. That's like a diary. It puts us in the story by reading it in a concrete way. So people talk about unreliable narratives. Interesting literature usually involves unreliable narratives. Makes us think, because unreliable narratives makes us think about the process, turns narrative into a question, makes it questionable. And that is so much a part of modern life, is the subjectivity of history, that you can see history from different perspectives. And so a lot of literature, especially modern literature, is about exploring how we negotiate unreliable narratives. And that can happen with blurring these levels, and that is really like life. We're always moving among these three levels. We can look at our own lives as if detached from a God's eye perspective. We actually, I think, spend a lot of time doing that, wondering what's the official version of what's going on in my life. We sort of survey that. If this first person point of view is the ego, this omniscient point of view is like the super ego, your conscience. What's monitoring and evaluating the supposed reality of the your story in life. Um, but this mid level is sort of where life actually happens, I think, where we're actually communicating with one another, exchanging what I mean for what you would say, what you mean with what I would say. This figurative echoing of one another, exchanging figurative representations of what's going on, communicating in the sense of music or dancing. So, unreliable narratives, by playing with these boundaries, playing with these different categories, they're negotiating really primal boundaries that we use to distinguish self and other, us and them. Most crucial kind of boundaries that organize our world, the most decisive boundaries of storytelling. You know, what's part of my story and what's an interruption or a threat outside my story. Junko refers to Hisa in Hopeful Monsters. The narrators are soft headed, confused, weirdly distorted, unreliable in various ways. But we can distinguish two basic categories of narrators: protagonist narrators and omniscient narrators. But they're all unreliable in different ways. So, unless the eye catch fire, the narrator is very much identified with the protagonist. It's a diary, right? So, in Borders, it's a diary, but the narrator is unreliable in the terms of his or her own world. The narrator is a shaker, is going crazy, according to the larger world in which the story is taking place. They're suffering from hallucinations. So they're an unreliable narrator within their own world. The narrator here takes us into experiences of these hallucinations that the rest of the world around him or her doesn't take to be real. In Borders, it's a little more complex, but I think it's analogous. It's likewise the protagonist narrator, the child in the story, is telling us the story. But what makes this narrator unreliable? I think it's because he or she is so young. He or she is telling us about experiences that he or she doesn't comprehend. He or she talks about spreading jelly on the truth. They seem more interested in getting an orange soda than in the emotional family drama that is actually the focus of this story. So that in that sense, this narrator is a little bit detached, is not yet consciously aware of the stakes. There's a suggestion that maybe subconsciously the child is remembering this stuff because it is so emotionally fraught, but the narrator doesn't know how to articulate that. They can't recognize that or isn't conscious of it. That makes the story very haunting, I think. Um, this reminds me, I have memories from my childhood that haunt me, but I don't know why. It's not clear in the memory why it seems so emotional. But you know what I mean? That I feel like that's what this story is. Giving us details that are emotionally supercharged. I mean, this is about the breakup and reuniting, configuration of a family, and but the child couldn't say that. The narrator wouldn't know that, wouldn't know to say that about their own story. The other two stories I'd characterize as unreliable, omniscient narrators. So in Hopeful Monsters, the narrator is very focused on the protagonist, but detached and analytical. So more like an omniscient narrator, a concerned but clinical God's eye view. Notice how the narrator speaks and ask yourself how and versus how Hisa speaks. They have very different idioms. So although the narrator is very much aligned with Hisa, the narrator speaks a very different language than her. Uh, many things are told in the narrative that Hisa herself would not say about herself. So that's a, and there's again an interesting kind of almost scientific. The narrator here is a little bit like Goldschmidt, a scientific. The narrator has a lot of technical um, understanding that's represented in technical vocabulary in the narrative that is very unlike Hisa's own um, words, self representation. So that disconnect is the source of ambiguity and unreliability. That again is the point of these stories, is negotiating these differently incomplete perspectives. And I think the short history of Indians in Canada is similarly narrated from an omniscient but distorted point of view. This is much more, like kind of a myth and an epic, but this omniscience is articulated in very strange, very distorted terms that, extremely dark, that disregards genocide. It fails to recognize genocide as what it is. So let's look at another passage. This is just like 3 pages in to Hopeful Monsters. Um, so he's reacting to Dr. Armstrong. Another sort of proper name like Goldschmidt or Frankenstein that doesn't actually represent a person so much as like this abstract scientific authority or just patriarchal authority. The subjective authority precisely not to be subjective but to be objective and to just tell you how things are. I want you to think about how this narration here responds to or replaces Dr. Armstrong's banal reassurances. What is there to worry about? You're about to embark on the most natural journey of life. A commonplace miracle. Ha ha ha. Um, this voice of authority and knowledge trying to reassure her in very banal terms that even he himself is laughing at. It's sort of like Goldschmidt putting monsters in quotation marks. It's like he doesn't even believe himself. So think about how this narrative here responds. How does this narrative represent Hisa's experience? She closed her eyes again. Dr. Armstrong was Bobby's doctor. She kept her eyes shut through the last of his commentary and reopened them only after his shoes squeaked through the door. It's very physical. The narrator doesn't tell us that she wasn't listening or trying not to hear Dr. Armstrong's words, but she tells us what she's doing with her body. She kept her eyes shut. It's as if but we can understand, we can make the connection that this physical gesture of keeping our eyes shut was a way of trying to keep his words out. So we're keeping his words out is it's like keeping his body out. She can only reopen her eyes once his body is out the door, and that's signaled by the squeaking sound. It's really a physical negotiating this doctor's perspective on her body, on her physical experience. What is her perspective on her body? He just stared at the bulge that rose magnificently from her midriff. The baby churned, digging a knee or elbow. She could see the skin give, as if an alien was trying to burst out of her belly even while she watched, alive and horrified. Well, she's having quite an intense, overwhelming physical experience. Not just being in her body, but being precisely alienated from her body. The pain, the discomfort of being in her own skin. But the definition of body horror, and she refers to the classic of body horror, Ridley Scott's 1979 movie Alien, and thereby, I think, signals the importance not just of language, but of cultural media in general, in terms as representing the body, transmitting bodily experiences, codifying bodily experiences, figuring embodied experience for one another. This gets, like the mother says about bad thoughts traveling down the umbilical tube to the baby. Our language, our cultural media transmit as if through umbilical tubes feelings, embodied feelings, what it is to be embodied, what a body is. So it's getting, what we're learning through the narrative here is that he's learned to be horrified from the Ridley Scott movie. Ridley Scott had a lot to answer for. And it's interesting, she immediately starts thinking about the law. Like, did he get sued for that? That horror is something that is illegal, that the law tries to regulate its effects. Americans she knew sued over things like spilled coffee and music videos with homosexual male police officers. So she's talking about, again, like the umbilical cord, media, culture, transmit bodily effects. They burn us, like unless the eye catch fire. They sexually confuse us or offend us or infect us. Relationship of the law to the untamable body, instilling us with pain or desires. And she thinks of other doctor authorities that she has learned about through culture, through TV, and makes a category mistake. No, he was a coroner. Yeah, those weren't servants of health, but servants of death. So we might map some of the terms. What I'm asking you to do here is map the terms of the narratives you read into these categories. Think about the relationship. Now, again, this is a matter of interpretation. There's no, this is about the relationship of the objective to the subjective. So there's no simply objective right answer. How we relate objective and subjective is going to entail our subjective judgment. But for the purposes of teaching, I'm going to suggest here that the language of the doctor, Dr. Armstrong, um, speaks with a kind of objective authority, even though it's banal cliches that he's using. They resonate with this authority of medicine, medical authority, science. He talks inanely about this is life's most natural journey, a commonplace miracle. Um, so these obviously aren't strictly objective terms like you might say about macromutation or whatever. But they're coming from the same sort of place of a voice of authority, the doctor's voice of authority. Likewise, I think at the beginning of the paragraph, when she's um, noticing the baby churning, elbowing, kicking inside her, and her skin giving as if an alien were inside, talking about psychological trauma and whether Ridley Scott is liable to lawsuits. These all seem to refer to objective reality. It's only when she then subsequently talks about the alien movie itself as offering a spectacle of horror, or spilled coffee, music videos with homosexual police officers. These all suggest a kind of figural meaning. What horror feels like gets transmitted. It's an interesting transition, I think, from the lawsuit to the homosexual police officer. The homosexual police officer is embodied, is sexy, and threatens to infect us with unwanted desires. It's interesting parallels, formal parallels there. It's like, what if I make my lawsuit for getting turned homosexual by the sexy police officer in the music video, and then when I go to court, there's another sexy police officer. Um, it's the same thing with like Marcus Welby, MD, is the doctor, but no, it turns out to be the coroner. These category boundaries are what we thought was absolute authority can actually be the embodiment of chaos. The authority over life can be the authority over death. So again, the way in which I filled out these categories is subjective, involves some interpretation. What's important is to map the kind of interplay of these different levels of experience and consciousness or narrative of experience. Uh, here's the famous eruption in Alien, the alien creature coming out. The man gives birth. There's an interesting, number of category binaries are blurred, troubled in this scene. It's a scene of dinner. They're all sitting around eating, and then this alien appears. It's so who's consuming who? Um, are you being consumed, or are you the consumer? Um, Obviously, male and female giving birth to this. It's a kind of birth scene, but it's a very phallic alien that erupts out of this man. There's a very clear racial subtext. So gender, race, us, them, animal, human. So, what I'm suggesting is like the film Alien, these stories, all in different ways, are drawing our attention, using language indirectly to draw our attention to what's taboo, what goes unsaid. These uh, texts are helping us to recognize and communicate what goes unsaid. Like cinema, I think they can be compared to kinds of technology. You know, they're manipulating language to bend these foundational boundaries between the objective and subjective, the concrete and abstract. You know, make us question what it means to prosper, what it means to survive, what it means to be lucky, um, and what it means to have a home, what it means to have a family, to belong to a family. These are all these basic boundaries getting negotiated in really profound ways in these stories. They're so powerful. Um, this book, written by the UBC faculty member Mandy Lynn Controne, How to Fall in Love with Anyone, is a fascinating story of this psychological experiment that was done in the 50s to see if love could be induced in laboratory settings, and they found out it could be. They devised a kind of totally impersonal um, um, formula for making people fall in love, and it's basically this questionnaire. It's really fascinating that people are just invited to go through together in a laboratory setting. Um, Given the choice of anyone in the world, whom would you want as a dinner guest? Who would you like to be famous? In what way? Before making a telephone call, do you ever rehearse what you're going to say? Why? What would constitute a perfect day for you? This is um, a formula for behavior. Go through these motions and you will fall in love. Have this conversation. Um, it's pretty amazing. And I think it's an interesting comparison to think of what we're doing when we're reading these texts about what good is normally unsaid. The love inducing formula is like these texts in that it's inviting us, forcing us maybe to probe our um, otherwise unacknowledged fears and desires, um, and make these communicable, share these. One final feature of this formula that's really interesting: the participants are asked to look in each other's eyes for 4 minutes or something straight, silently, just looking at each other. Um, and it's kind of like a mutual imprinting. Um, but I think, acknowledgement of the specificity of the other, whatever that, radical singularity is that's you, even beyond your name. It's like my concern for you as a living, changing, creature um, gets crystallized in that kind of experience of just paying attention to you for 4 minutes. I mean, isn't it crazy that you put a number on that? Like, yeah, 4 minutes will do. Um, but that's sort of what these short stories are, isn't it? It's like sit down, spend some time in this other world, in this other body, and you're changed by it. It's like watching a movie. You're um, yeah, troubled enriched your world, the variety of material, sensuous experience, what you acknowledge as possible human experience, as possible part of your world, is enriched through things like movies or peopled, and what populated, as they say, I think in scientific experiments, it's like populate the field with the data. Your world of concepts of possible stories is getting populated with actual people, actual experiences that you're giving really focused attention to when you read a story or watch a movie. And so the point is, we can really rewire ourselves and our categories of us and them, self and other. It makes these Frankenstein stories of constructing new human, like Goldschmidt at the beginning of Hopeful Monsters. They actually do that. Like literature actually does that. It performs. I think that's one way of reading the story. It performs that macro evolution. Now I belong. I recognize um, what was a monster. I'm part of it. I I recognize the possibility of that hope of a monster, or that prosperity, a monster's prosperity. I've become a part of that through the process of reading the story. I think that's a powerful way of thinking about what is at stake when we empathize with characters and imaginary characters and stories.